June 6, 1942. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The morning sun glinted off a strip of barren dirt and dusty scrubland, where a small group of soldiers squinted at a curious contraption lying on the ground. It looked like nothing more than a metal tube, no longer than a broomstick, with a crude trigger mechanism and a wire sighting system. To anyone passing by, it might have seemed a joke, an oversized toy made by a tinkering armorer with too much imagination. But in a few short years, that unassuming tube would terrorize German tank crews across Europe and North Africa. At first, the soldiers themselves were skeptical. "You want me to shoot what at a panzer?" one private muttered, brushing the dust off his uniform. The engineers, meanwhile, quietly hoped this prototype would be a miracle rather than a death trap. Their optimism was measured, because up to this point, infantry weapons against armored tanks were laughable. Small arms did little more than tickle steel. Yet the problem was urgent. German tanks, especially the Panzer IV and later the Tiger, dominated the battlefield. They were fast, well-armored, and devastatingly effective against soldiers on foot. Infantry units had no real answer. Artillery support was scarce, and air strikes were never guaranteed. The need for a portable infantry-friendly anti-tank weapon had never been more acute. Entered the bazooka. The first tests were almost comical. Soldiers aimed, fired, and occasionally missed entirely, rockets fizzing harmlessly into the sky. And yet, the few successful hits were stunning. A single shot could pierce 60 millimeters of armor at 100 yards, enough to disable the average German medium tank. The roar of the warhead detonating sent clouds of sand and debris into the air, and the echoing blast left onlookers wide-eyed. One private reportedly whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief, "I fired it, and the tank poof, just like smoke from chimney." We couldn't believe it. Dr. Robert Basil, the engineer often credited with conceptualizing the device, quietly noted in his journal that day, "It is as if the infantry now wields a lightning bolt in their hands, small but deadly." By the end of 1942, the U.S. Army officially adopted the weapon, christening it the M1 rocket launcher. Those soldiers quickly gave it the nickname that would become legendary, the bazooka. Even German intelligence began to notice. Reports trickled back to Berlin, describing a mysterious American anti-tank tube capable of destroying our vehicles from a distance. Commanders dismissed the early warnings as exaggerations. Yet, by 1943, those reports would prove disturbingly accurate. Field anecdotes from North Africa illustrate the surreal impact. A bazooka team, 3 men deep in the desert, encountered a German convoy of Panzer IIIs and IVs. One rocket hit a tank directly, and the engine compartment erupted in flames. German crews scrambled in disbelief. One officer reportedly told his men, "This is no ordinary rifle. It is a trick, a devil's tool we cannot anticipate." Soldiers, meanwhile, began to see the tube not as a toy, but as a miracle, a metal wand that could level an armored giant. And yet, the irony was palpable. The same men who mocked the bazooka for its almost comical appearance were now relying on it to survive, their morale soaring with each tank disabled. Humble, unassuming, and almost absurd in design, the bazooka became a symbol of ingenuity, proof that even in a war dominated by massive machinery, a small, clever device could tip the balance. By the end of Section 1, the narrative arc is clear, a simple tube, born of necessity and ingenuity, had moved from a skeptical experiment in Maryland to a weapon that instilled awe and fear across continents. Soldiers' attitudes had transformed, enemy tactics were beginning to shift, and the world was only starting to grasp the implications. But as the weapon moved from testing grounds to battlefields, its true effect, the complete shock and re-evaluation of armored warfare, was only just beginning. But if they thought a simple tube could end the war, they were about to learn that the bazooka's real impact was only beginning. July 25, 1944. Normandy, France. The morning fog clung to the hedgerows, muffling the rumble of distant artillery. Amid the chaos, small teams of American infantry moved cautiously, metal tubes slung across their shoulders. The bazooka, once dismissed as a curious experiment back in Maryland, was now an essential weapon in the fight against German armor. Its presence alone changed the way soldiers thought about battle. Before the bazooka, infantrymen faced a grim reality. Panzer tanks could roll across fields and roads almost unchecked. Rifle fire bounced harmlessly off their steel sides, and artillery was slow, cumbersome, or simply unavailable. Soldiers felt helpless, often relying on luck more than skill. But with the bazooka, that dynamic shifted. A single soldier could disable a tank in seconds, turning fear into action, hesitation into opportunity. The effect on German forces was immediate and disorienting. Field reports from July 1944 described soldiers frozen behind destroyed panzers, smoke curling from engines, the acrid smell of melted metal in the air. One German officer noted in his diary, "Our tanks are no longer invincible. The Americans wield something small and deadly. It is as though the very ground beneath us conspires against us." Statistics back the stories. During the Normandy campaign, bazooka teams were credited with disabling roughly 1,200 to 1,500 German tanks. They were not invincible, but their impact was decisive in slowing advances, supporting infantry, and giving soldiers confidence. Witness accounts recall the blast throwing mud and dust into the air, soldiers' hearts racing as they took aim, fired, and saw steel hulls collapse like paper under the fiery rocket. Personal stories make the numbers tangible. Private James Hall, a 19-year-old from Ohio, wrote to his mother after a skirmish near Cannes, "I never thought I'd hit a tank. We lined up, fired, and it just stopped. Smoke and fire everywhere. I felt like a magician." On the German side, a tank crewman recalled in a post-war interview, "We laughed at the Americans at first. Then the first hit came, and we couldn't believe it. It was terrifying and embarrassing." The bazooka's influence extended beyond the battlefield. It inspired tactics, shaped strategy, and altered the psychology of warfare. Infantry units were no longer passive participants under armored dominance. They could fight back, even against superior firepower. Commanders adapted, sending small teams ahead of tanks to scout and neutralize threats, turning the bazooka into a tool not only of destruction, but of empowerment. There was, of course, room for irony. For all its sophistication, the bazooka was fragile. Rockets misfired, tubes cracked, and in the middle of a firefight, the weapon could suddenly fail. Soldiers joked bitterly that it was a miracle when it works, a temperamental diva when it doesn't. Yet these quirks never diminished its legend. Its symbolic power, the sense that one man could stand against a machine, was more important than perfection. By late 1944, even Allied commanders began to take note. British and Soviet forces observed the American infantry's newfound anti-tank capabilities with a mix of admiration and envy. Field manuals began incorporating lessons learned from bazooka use, cementing its place in modern military doctrine. The once quirky tube was now a cornerstone of infantry tactics. The emotional transformation was profound. Soldiers, who had once feared tanks, now approached them with a calculated mix of caution and confidence. German troops, meanwhile, were forced to rethink their armored superiority. It was no longer a straightforward contest of metal versus men. Now ingenuity, courage, and technology could tip the balance. And so, the bazooka became more than a weapon. It was a symbol of adaptability, ingenuity, and the surprising potency of small forces in a vast war. A tool born of necessity, honed by engineering and wielded by determined soldiers, it reshaped not just individual battles, but the mindset of armies. By the time the Allied forces pushed across Europe, the bazooka had done more than destroy tanks. It had shifted the psychology of war, proving that even the mightiest machines were not invulnerable. A simple tube, once laughed at in a proving ground, had become a giant, both feared and respected. And for the soldiers who carried it, the line between hope and despair had never been thinner, nor the impact of courage more tangible.